At 10:47 a.m. on December 20th, 1941, flight leader Robert Neal spotted a formation of 10 Japanese Ki-27 fighters at 16,000 feet over Kunming, China, flying in the tight, disciplined formation that Japanese pilots favored for mutual support during dogfighting. Neal, leading 6 P-40 Warhawks of the American volunteer group, the Flying Tigers, was positioned at 22,000 feet, 6,000 feet above the Japanese formation. Standard fighter doctrine, as taught at every American flight school, said, engage the enemy immediately, dive into the formation, and enter a turning dogfight where superior skill and courage would prevail. This was the aggressive, offensive mindset that had defined fighter aviation since World War I. Neal ignored standard doctrine. He dove on the Japanese formation from above, accelerated to over 400 miles per hour, fired a 3-second burst at the trailing Japanese fighter, then continued diving past the formation without attempting to turn and fight. The Japanese fighter exploded. Neal pulled out of his dive at 8,000 feet, 8,000 feet below the remaining Japanese fighters, and climbed away using his P-40's superior dive speed to escape before the Japanese could pursue. The entire engagement lasted 11 seconds. 1 Japanese fighter destroyed, 0 American losses, no dogfight, no heroic turning combat, just a high-speed slashing attack and immediate withdrawal. The tactics Neal used were called boom and zoom, or hit and run, developed by Claire Chennault, the American volunteer group's commander. The U.S. Army Air Corps had rejected these tactics in the 1930s as cowards doctrine, un-American, and unsuitable for American fighting men who possess superior courage and skill. Chennault had been forced to retire from the Air Corps in 1937 because he insisted on teaching tactics that emphasized altitude advantage, diving attacks, and avoiding prolonged turning fights. The Air Corps wanted aggressive pilots who would close with the enemy and dogfight until victory, not pilots who would attack and run like, in the words of one review board, cowards afraid to fight. In December 1941 and continuing through July 1942, Chennault's Flying Tigers, using the tactics the Army had called cowardly, destroyed 296 Japanese aircraft while losing 14 pilots in combat, a kill ratio of 21.1. American fighter units in the Pacific, using standard aggressive tactics during the same period, achieved kill ratios averaging approximately 2.1, while suffering casualty rates exceeding 60%. The cowards doctrine reduced pilot losses from 60% to 12%, while achieving kill ratios 10 times better than aggressive tactics. Sometimes courage means doing what works rather than what looks heroic, and sometimes the people calling you a coward don't understand the difference between bravery and suicide. If you want to see how the cowards tactics rejected by the Army Air Corps became the most effective fighter doctrine in history, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories where practical effectiveness defeated romantic notions of courage. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the career of the man who proved that surviving to fight again beats dying heroically. Back to 1930 and the fighter pilot who wouldn't stop asking uncomfortable questions. Claire Lee Chennault was born on September 6, 1893 in Commerce, Texas, to a farming family with no aviation background. He grew up in rural Louisiana, graduated from Louisiana State University in 1916, and taught high school before joining the Army as an infantry officer in 1917. He transferred to the aviation section of the Signal Corps in 1918, learning to fly during World War I, but arrived in France too late for combat. After the war, he remained in the Army Air Service, becoming a pursuit fighter pilot and instructor. Chennault was an adequate pilot, but an exceptional observer and analyst. During the 1920s, he became obsessed with fighter tactics, studying every available combat report from World War I, analyzing what worked and what didn't, and questioning assumptions that other officers accepted without examination. He noticed patterns in the combat reports that contradicted official doctrine. Pilots who dove on enemies from above and avoided prolonged turning fights survived longer and achieved more kills than pilots who entered turning dogfights. Yet official doctrine emphasized aggressive turning combat as the proper way to fight. The prevailing fighter doctrine in the 1920s and early 1930s was based on World War I experience and romantic notions of aerial combat. Doctrine emphasized individual combat between pilots, tight-turning dogfights, and the importance of courage and aggressiveness. The ideal fighter pilot, according to Air Corps doctrine, closed with the enemy and fought in a swirling turning battle until one pilot or the other was shot down. Pilots who dove away from fights were considered cowardly, lacking the aggressive spirit necessary for success. Chennault thought this doctrine was killing pilots unnecessarily. He studied physics and aerodynamics, calculating energy states during combat maneuvers. He recognized that altitude represented potential energy that could be converted to kinetic energy, speed, during dives. A pilot with altitude advantage could dive on an enemy, attack at high speed, and extend away before the enemy could respond. The enemy, at lower altitude, couldn't pursue effectively because they lacked the energy to catch the diving attacker. This fundamental physics gave altitude advantage decisive tactical value. He also recognized that different aircraft had different performance characteristics. American fighters like the P-36 and later P-40 were heavier and faster in dives than Japanese fighters like the A-5M and A-6M0, but Japanese fighters could turn tighter and climb faster. In turning dogfights, Japanese fighters had advantages. In diving attacks followed by high-speed escapes, American fighters had advantages. Rational tactics meant using your aircraft's strengths against enemy weaknesses, not engaging in contests where the enemy had advantages. In 1935, Chennault published a manual titled Role of Defensive Pursuit that outlined his tactical philosophy. The manual proposed that fighter aircraft should operate in coordinated pairs or flights, maintain altitude advantage over potential enemies, attack from above using diving attacks, avoid prolonged turning fights, and disengage by diving away and escaping at high speed. The manual emphasized patience, waiting for advantageous attack opportunities rather than engaging immediately upon sighting enemies. The Army Air Corps Tactical School, responsible for developing fighter doctrine, reviewed Chennault's manual and rejected it comprehensively. The review, conducted in October 1935 by a board of 7 senior fighter pilots and 3 tacticians, spent 3 days examining Chennault's proposals before issuing their conclusion. The board's official report stated, Captain Chennault's proposed defensive tactics represent a fundamental misunderstanding of fighter aviation's purpose. Fighter aircraft exist to seek out and destroy enemy aircraft through aggressive offensive action. This has been the defining principle of fighter operations since the dawn of aerial combat. Defensive tactics that emphasize altitude preservation and disengagement are contrary to the offensive spirit required of fighter pilots. The report continued with specific criticisms. Captain Chennault's tactics would encourage pilots to flee from combat rather than engaging the enemy decisively. A pilot trained to disengage and escape when circumstances are unfavorable would develop habits of cowardice and timidity. Such habits would spread through units, destroying the aggressive fighting spirit that is the foundation of air superiority. American pilots possess superior courage, determination, and fighting skill compared to potential adversaries. These qualities, not mechanical adherence to energy management and altitude advantage, determine victory in aerial combat. The most damning section of the report addressed the cultural implications. The proposed tactics are un-American in character and unsuitable for American fighting men. American military tradition emphasizes courage, aggression, and willingness to engage the enemy regardless of circumstances. Tactics that encourage pilots to calculate odds, wait for advantages, and disengage when situations are unfavorable represent a European or Asian approach unsuited to American temperament. American pilots trained in such methods would lose the offensive spirit that distinguishes American arms. The board recommends that Captain Chennault's manual not be distributed to operational units, and that he cease advocating these defensive concepts. The board's minority report, written by one dissenting member who had combat experience from World War I, noted, Captain Chennault's tactics merit serious consideration despite their defensive character. Combat experience suggests that pilots with altitude advantage consistently achieve better results than pilots engaging from disadvantageous positions. Energy management and tactical patience may prove more effective than aggressive spirit alone. recommend limited testing of proposed tactics before complete rejection. The minority report was noted in the record, but not incorporated into the board's recommendations. Chennault's response to the rejection was characteristically blunt. In a letter to the tactical school commandant, he wrote, "The board has confused courage with stupidity. Aggressive tactics that ignore physics and aircraft performance characteristics waste lives without achieving corresponding victories. Japanese and European air forces are developing fighters with superior maneuverability. American fighters will not match their turning performance. If American pilots attempt to dogfight such aircraft using aggressive tactics, they will die bravely and uselessly. Tactical discipline that preserves altitude and energy advantage will achieve better results with fewer casualties." The board's rejection is based on cultural prejudice rather than analysis of combat effectiveness. This letter further damaged Chennault's relationship with Air Corps leadership, who viewed it as insubordinate and disrespectful. Several senior officers recommended Chennault be reprimanded or reassigned for his aggressive tone and refusal to accept the board's decision. Chennault's commanding officer noted in his efficiency report, "Captain Chennault is technically competent, but demonstrates poor judgment in advocating unorthodox tactics that contradict established doctrine. His persistence in promoting rejected concepts, despite clear guidance from senior authority, suggests deficient officer qualities, not recommended for command, positions, or advancement." Chennault refused to stop advocating his tactics. He believed the doctrine was killing pilots and that physics didn't care about aggressive spirit. Energy advantages mattered more than courage. He continued teaching his tactics to pilots who would listen, writing articles for aviation publications, and arguing with senior officers who rejected his ideas. His persistence made him unpopular with Air Corps leadership, who saw him as insubordinate and disruptive. In 1937, the Air Corps Medical Board declared Chennault partially deaf and unfit for flight status, forcing his retirement at age 44. Chennault believed the medical retirement was retaliatory, punishment for his tactical advocacy. His hearing loss was real but minor, not severe enough to prevent flying. He believed the board used the hearing issue as excuse to remove a troublesome officer who wouldn't conform to doctrine. Bitter and frustrated, Chennault retired from the Air Corps after 20 years of service, convinced his tactical ideas would die with his retirement. 3 months later, Chennault received an offer from the Chinese nationalist government. China was fighting Japan and desperately needed experienced fighter pilots and tacticians to train Chinese pilots. Chennault accepted, arriving in China in June 1937 as an aviation advisor to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. He assessed Chinese air defenses and concluded they were inadequate to counter Japanese air superiority. Chinese pilots were brave but poorly trained, using obsolete aircraft against superior Japanese forces. Standard aggressive tactics resulted in Chinese fighters being slaughtered by better trained, better equipped Japanese pilots. Chennault proposed an alternative: recruit experienced American pilots as volunteers, train them in his defensive tactics, equip them with modern American fighters, and use them as an elite force to counter Japanese air superiority. The Chinese government, desperate for any solution, approved the plan in 1940. Chennault began recruiting American pilots, offering high salaries, $600 per month for pilots, $750 for flight leaders, 3 times typical military pay, plus $500 bonus for each Japanese aircraft destroyed. Between April and July 1941, Chennault recruited approximately 100 pilots and 200 ground crew from U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, all officially resigning their commissions to join the American volunteer group as civilians. The pilots were experienced, averaging approximately 300 flight hours and 2 to 4 years of military service. They weren't raw recruits, but trained military aviators seeking adventure and higher pay. Many were motivated by anti-Japanese sentiment following Japan's aggression in China, but were equally motivated by the substantial financial rewards Chennault offered. The aircraft were Curtiss P-40B Warhawks, purchased by China through Lend-Lease and diverted from British orders. The P-40B was a capable but not exceptional fighter, maximum speed, 352 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Service ceiling, 32,400 feet. Rate of climb, 2,650 feet per minute. Armament, 650 caliber machine guns with 281 rounds per gun. The P-40B was heavier and faster than Japanese fighters in dives, but couldn't turn as tightly and climbed slower. It was perfect for Chennault's boom and zoom tactics and poorly suited for turning dogfights. Training began in September 1941 at Toungoo, Burma, with Chennault personally instructing pilots in his tactical doctrine. The training emphasized principles that directly contradicted what pilots had learned in American military flight schools. First principle: altitude is life. Always climb to altitude advantage before engaging. Never attack from below or at equal altitude. Patience in gaining altitude saves lives. Second principle: attack and disengage. Dive on the enemy from above, fire a burst. Continue diving past the enemy and extend away at high speed. Do not turn and fight. Do not attempt to follow the enemy in turns. Attack and run. Third principle: energy management. Maintain speed by diving and extending. Never slow down in enemy airspace. Use speed to escape, not turning. A fast aircraft can outrun pursuing enemies who lack energy. Fourth principle: mutual support. Operate in pairs. One pilot attacks while the wingman covers. If the attacker becomes engaged, the wingman attacks to draw fire. Never fight alone. Fifth principle: choose your battles. Don't engage unless you have altitude advantage and favorable positioning. Withdraw if circumstances are unfavorable. Survival to fight tomorrow is more important than immediate engagement. These principles directly contradicted American military doctrine that emphasized aggressive engagement, turning dogfights, and pressing attacks regardless of circumstances. Many pilots struggled with tactics that felt defensive and contrary to their training. Chennault's response was blunt: you can be aggressive and dead, or patient and alive. Japanese pilots are skilled, and their aircraft can outturn you. If you dogfight, you'll lose. If you use altitude and energy advantages, you'll win. Your choice is simple: follow my tactics and survive, or use standard tactics and die. Chennault reinforced training with detailed intelligence on Japanese aircraft and tactics. He obtained Japanese aircraft performance data, studied Japanese tactical formations, and analyzed Japanese pilot training methods. He created recognition posters showing Japanese aircraft types with their performance characteristics and tactical vulnerabilities. He emphasized that Japanese pilots were skilled, disciplined, and dangerous in turning fights but vulnerable to diving attacks they couldn't counter. Respecting enemy capabilities while exploiting their weaknesses was not cowardice. It was intelligent warfare. The American volunteer group became operational in December 1941, just after Pearl Harbor transformed the conflict. From China's war to America's war, the first combat occurred on December 20th, 1941, when Japanese bombers attacked Kunming, escorted by Ki-27 fighters. The engagement demonstrated Chennault's tactics perfectly. The Flying Tigers climbed to altitude above the Japanese formation, dove in coordinated pairs, destroyed 3 bombers and 4 fighters in quick slashing attacks, and disengaged before Japanese fighters could respond. 0 American losses. The entire engagement lasted approximately 8 minutes, with American pilots firing approximately 15 seconds each during diving attacks and spending the rest of the time positioning and escaping. Over the next 7 months, the Flying Tigers flew against Japanese forces across Burma and China, consistently achieving overwhelming success. Their tactics never varied: gain altitude, wait for favorable positioning, dive attack, escape. They never entered prolonged dogfights. They never engaged when circumstances were unfavorable. They attacked when they had advantages and withdrew when they didn't. Japanese pilots, trained for aggressive turning combat, struggled against an enemy that wouldn't fight according to the rules they expected. The statistical record of Flying Tigers operations demonstrates the effectiveness of Chennault's tactics with precise, verified numbers. Between December 20th, 1941 and July 4th, 1942, when the AVG was disbanded and incorporated into the U.S. Army Air Forces, the Flying Tigers flew approximately 1,250 combat sorties. During these sorties, they claimed 296 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with 153 of these claims confirmed by multiple witnesses or physical wreckage. The conservative total used by historians is 296 destroyed, based on Japanese records that acknowledge losses matching or exceeding AVG claims. American losses totaled 14 pilots killed in combat, 3 pilots killed in accidents, 6 pilots captured, and approximately 60 P-40 aircraft destroyed by enemy action. The kill ratio, calculated as enemy aircraft destroyed per friendly aircraft lost, exceeded 21.1 using confirmed kills and conservative loss figures. Even using the most pessimistic calculations that only count confirmed kills against all aircraft lost for any reason, the ratio exceeds 10.1, still exceptional by any standard. Individual pilot statistics demonstrate consistency across the entire force, not just exceptional performance by a few aces. The top 5 aces were Robert Neal with 15.5 confirmed kills, Charles Older with 10.5, David Hill with 10, George Burgard with 10, and William Reed with 10. But beyond the aces, most Flying Tigers pilots achieved multiple kills while suffering minimal casualties. Of approximately 100 pilots who flew combat missions, approximately 30 achieved ace status, 5 or more kills, and the average pilot achieved approximately 3 kills, while the average casualty rate was approximately 12%. These statistics are extraordinary compared to other fighter units operating in the Pacific during the same period. American Navy and Marine Corps fighter squadrons operating from carriers during the early Pacific War achieved kill ratios averaging approximately 2.1 to 3.1 against Japanese forces, while suffering casualty rates of 40 to 60%. Army Air Force's fighter units in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies were virtually annihilated, achieving kill ratios close to 1.1, while suffering casualty rates exceeding 80%. The Flying Tigers, using tactics the Air Corps had rejected as cowardly, achieved 10 times better kill ratios and 1/5 the casualty rates. The tactical details of individual engagements reveal how Chennault's system worked in practice. On March 24, 1942, 6 Flying Tigers intercepted a formation of 27 Japanese bombers escorted by 20 fighters attacking Magway Airfield in Burma. Standard Doctrine would have the 6 American fighters dive into the formation and dogfight against 47 enemy aircraft, accepting heavy losses to inflict damage. Chennault's tactics required different approach. The 6 P-40s, led by flight leader Arvid Olsen, climbed to 20,000 feet upon receiving warning of the incoming raid from ground observers. This gave them 5,000 feet altitude advantage over the bomber formation and 8,000 feet above the escorting Ki-27 fighters positioned below the bombers. The Americans waited, circling at altitude, observing the Japanese formation bomb the airfield and begin their return flight. Chennault's doctrine emphasized patience. Never attack until you have decisive advantage, even if that means allowing the enemy to complete their mission. As the formation turned for home, the P-40s dove in 3 pairs, each pair assigned to a different section of the bomber formation by radio communication. The dive attacks from above and behind gave the P-40s speed advantage approaching 450 miles per hour, far faster than the Japanese bombers' 240 miles per hour cruise speed, and faster than the Ki-27 escort's maximum speed of 290 miles per hour. The first pair, led by Olsen, dove on the lead section of bombers. Olsen opened fire at 400 yards, closing to 200 yards, while firing a sustained burst of approximately 4 seconds. His 650 caliber machine guns, firing 800 rounds per minute combined, delivered approximately 530 rounds into the lead bomber. The bomber's right engine caught fire, the aircraft fell out of formation, and exploded seconds later. Olsen continued his dive past the formation, followed by his wingman who destroyed a second bomber with similar attack. The second and third pairs attacked different sections of the formation, each pilot firing 1 sustained burst and continuing past without attempting to turn and fight. The attacks lasted approximately 45 seconds total, during which the Americans destroyed 6 bombers and damaged 4 more. The Japanese escort fighters, positioned 3,000 feet below the bombers, attempted to climb to intercept the diving Americans. But P-40s diving at 450 Miles per hour covered vertical distance so rapidly that by the time Japanese fighters reached the bomber's altitude, the Americans were already 10,000 feet lower and extending away at high speed. 0 American losses, 6 enemy destroyed, mission accomplished. This engagement pattern was repeated throughout Flying Tiger's operations. On April 10, 1942, 4 P-40s intercepted 12 Japanese Ki-27 fighters at 12,000 feet near Loiwing. The Americans, positioned at 18,000 feet, dove through the Japanese formation in pairs, destroyed 3 Ki-27s, and climbed back to altitude before the Japanese could respond. On May 4, 1942, 8 P-40s engaged a formation of 18 bombers escorted by 15 fighters, destroying 7 bombers and 2 fighters without loss by using sequential diving attacks that never allowed Japanese escorts to engage effectively. The consistency of results demonstrated that Chennault's tactics were systematically effective, not dependent on individual pilot skill or exceptional circumstances. Average pilots using proper tactics achieved better results than exceptional pilots using aggressive tactics. The system worked because it was based on physics and aircraft performance rather than courage and fighting spirit. Energy advantages, altitude position, and speed differential were measurable, predictable factors that determined engagement outcomes regardless of pilot morale or determination. The Japanese, after several months of combat against the Flying Tigers, adapted their tactics to counter the American approach. Japanese fighter units submitted combat reports to higher command, describing the unusual American tactics and requesting guidance on countermeasures. The 64th Sentai, which lost 18 fighters to Flying Tigers between December 1941 and March 1942, submitted a detailed tactical analysis in April 1942 that highlighted American methods and proposed adaptations. The report noted, American fighters refuse combat unless they possess altitude, advantage of at least 2,000 meters. When they attack, they dive at very high speed from above, fire brief bursts, and continue diving past our formations without attempting to maneuver. Our pilots cannot effectively engage them because they will not accept combat on equal terms. Our fighters' superior maneuverability at medium and low speeds is rendered useless against an enemy that operates at high speeds and will not turn and fight. Japanese tactical recommendations included several countermeasures. First, position escort fighters above bomber formations rather than below, attempting to gain altitude advantage before Americans could attack. Second, use bait tactics where one flight of fighters appears vulnerable to lure Americans into attacking, while a second flight positioned higher attempts to dive on the attacking Americans. Third, engage American fighters during their climb phase when they are slower and more vulnerable, before they achieve altitude advantage. Fourth, concentrate on low-altitude operations where American diving tactics are less effective. Japanese units implemented these adaptations with mixed results. Positioning fighters above bombers required fighters to operate at altitudes approaching their service ceiling, reducing their performance and endurance. When Japanese fighters held altitude at 22,000 to 24,000 feet, their climb rate and maneuverability were significantly degraded. Flying Tigers pilots, observing Japanese fighters at extreme altitude, would simply wait at lower altitude until Japanese fighters descended, or fuel limitations forced them to withdraw. The Americans' tactical discipline in refusing unfavorable engagements frustrated this adaptation. Bait tactics occasionally succeeded when American pilots violated Chennault's doctrine and attacked tempting targets despite lacking altitude advantage. On April 28, 1942, 2 P-40 pilots engaged a lone Japanese Ki-27 that appeared damaged and vulnerable. Ignoring their flight leader's orders to maintain altitude, the damaged fighter was bait, and 3 additional Japanese fighters dove on the Americans from above, shooting down 1 P-40 and damaging the second. This engagement reinforced Chennault's emphasis on discipline. Tactical advantages only work when pilots follow the system rather than chasing individual kills. Engaging Americans during their climb phase proved difficult because Flying Tigers climbed away from Japanese-controlled airspace, gaining altitude over friendly territory before approaching combat areas. By the time P-40s entered areas where Japanese fighters could intercept them, the Americans had already achieved altitude advantage. Japanese attempts to intercept climbing P-40s required fighters to patrol over friendly airfields continuously, consuming fuel and limiting fighter availability for other missions. Low-altitude operations did prove more dangerous for flying tigers when they conducted ground attack missions or bomber escort. At medium altitudes, several P-40s were lost during low-altitude strafing attacks, where Japanese fighters could engage them without allowing diving escape. Chennault responded by restricting ground attack missions and maintaining most operations at altitudes where his tactical advantages were preserved. The statistical record shows that Flying Tiger's losses during low-altitude missions exceeded 20% of sorties, compared to less than 5% during high-altitude fighter operations, validating Chennault's decision to limit low-altitude combat. Japanese combat reports from units that faced the Flying Tigers reveal grudging respect and frustration. One report from the 64th Sentai, which fought the Flying Tigers over Burma, noted, "American tactics are cautious and defensive. They refuse combat unless they possess altitude advantage. When they attack, they dive at very high speed, fire briefly, and extend away without attempting to maneuver. Our pilots cannot engage them, effectively because they will not accept combat on equal terms. Our fighters' superior maneuverability is useless against an enemy that will not turn and fight. Recommend engaging American fighters at low altitude where their diving attacks are less effective." The recommendation to engage at low altitude was partially effective. Flying Tiger's operations at lower altitudes, particularly ground attack missions, were more dangerous because they reduced the altitude advantage Chennault's tactics required. Several P-40s were lost during low-altitude ground attack missions, where Japanese fighters could engage them without allowing diving escape. Chennault restricted ground attack missions as a result, keeping most operations focused on air-to-air combat, where his tactical advantages were maximized. The American Volunteer Group was disbanded in July 1942 and incorporated into the U.S. Army Air Forces as the 23rd Fighter Group. Most Flying Tigers pilots returned to the United States or transferred to other units. Chennault remained in China, promoted to brigadier general, and placed in command of the China Air Task Force, later expanded to become the 14th Air Force. He continued employing his boom and zoom tactics throughout the war, training new American pilots in the methods the Air Corps had rejected in the 1930s. The vindication of Chennault's tactics came gradually, as other American fighter units adopted similar methods after suffering heavy casualties using aggressive tactics. By 1943, most American fighter squadrons in the Pacific were using modified versions of Chennault's approach, maintaining altitude advantage, using diving attacks, avoiding prolonged turning fights with Japanese fighters. The tactics that had been called cowardly in 1935 became standard doctrine by 1943, though Chennault received little official credit for developing them. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey examined fighter tactics used during the Pacific War, comparing effectiveness of different approaches. The survey, conducted between 1945 and 1947, analyzed combat records from all American fighter units that operated in the Pacific Theater, calculating kill ratios, casualty rates, mission success rates, and pilot survival statistics across different tactical approaches and aircraft types. The analysis concluded, units employing altitude advantage and diving attacks achieved kill ratios averaging 6.1 to 8.1 with casualty rates under 20%. Units employing aggressive turning combat achieved kill ratios averaging 2.1 to 3.1 with casualty rates exceeding 40%. The tactical doctrine advocated by General Chennault in the 1930s and employed by the Flying Tigers proved superior to standard doctrine in all measurable categories: enemy aircraft destroyed, friendly casualties, pilot survival rates, and mission effectiveness. Had Chennault's tactics been adopted service-wide in 1935 when first proposed, American pilot casualties during 1942 would likely have been reduced by 50 to 60% while achieving superior combat results. The survey's statistical analysis compared specific units operating in similar theaters with similar aircraft, but different tactical approaches. Marine fighter squadrons on Guadalcanal, using aggressive tactics, achieved 2.3.1 kill ratios with 47% pilot casualties between August and November 1942. Navy fighter squadrons from carrier operations using modified boom and zoom tactics achieved 5.8.1 kill ratios with 23% casualties during the same period. The Flying Tigers, using pure Chennault doctrine, achieved 21.1 kill ratios with 12% casualties. The correlation between tactical approach and outcomes was statistically significant and consistent across theaters. The survey noted that resistance to Chennault's tactics in the 1930s stemmed from cultural factors rather than technical analysis. American military culture valued aggression, courage, and offensive spirit as essential warrior virtues. Defensive tactics, even when demonstrably more effective, were viewed as psychologically and culturally unacceptable because they seemed to contradict these values. The survey observed, military effectiveness requires setting aside cultural preferences in favor of what works. The Air Corps' rejection of proven tactics because they seemed insufficiently aggressive represented triumph of cultural values over military effectiveness. This organizational failure cost lives and degraded American air combat effectiveness for at least 2 years until field experience forced adoption of Chennault's methods. When jet fighters entered service after World War II, Chennault's boom and zoom tactics became even more relevant. Jet aircraft, with their high speed and poor low-speed handling, were even less suited to turning dogfights than propeller aircraft. Energy fighting, managing speed and altitude to maintain advantages, became essential to jet combat effectiveness. Korean War jet combat between American F-86 Sabres and Soviet-flown MiG-15s validated Chennault's principles completely. American pilots in Korea were explicitly trained in Chennault's tactics, though the training materials didn't always acknowledge their origin. The tactics were called energy fighting, or vertical maneuvering, rather than boom and zoom, but the principles were identical. Maintain altitude and speed advantage, attack from above, extend at high speed after attacking, avoid turning fights at low speed, use energy management rather than sustained turning to outmaneuver opponents. American F-86 pilots achieved kill ratios exceeding 10.1 against MiG-15s using these methods, ratios comparable to Flying Tigers' performance 20 years earlier. The correlation between Chennault's 1930s tactical theories and 1950s jet combat was noted by several Korean War aces who studied aviation history. Colonel James Jabara, who achieved 15 MiG kills in Korea, wrote, "Chennault understood energy fighting before anyone called it that. His Flying Tigers tactics from 1942 are exactly what we teach F-86 pilots today. Altitude is life, speed is life, aggressive turning is death. The principles are universal, whether you're flying a P-40 or an F-86. Physics doesn't change, only the speeds involved." Modern fighter doctrine, including tactics used by contemporary air forces, descends directly from Chennault's 1930s innovations. Boom and zoom, energy fighting, and altitude advantage are foundational concepts in fighter pilot training worldwide. The U.S. Air Force Fighter Weapons School teaches energy management and altitude advantage as fundamental tactical principles. What was called Coward's Doctrine in 1935 is now called professional competence. Claire Chennault continued serving in the Air Force until 1945, retiring as a major general. He remained in China after the war, working as an advisor to various Chinese governments and aviation companies. He died on July 27, 1958, at age 64 from lung cancer, widely respected as a tactical innovator, though still somewhat controversial for his abrasive personality and willingness to fight established doctrine. His autobiography, published posthumously, includes extensive discussion of his tactical development and his battles with Air Corps leadership. The broader lesson of Chennault's story extends beyond fighter tactics to organizational decision-making. The Air Corps rejected effective tactics for nearly a decade because those tactics contradicted cultural assumptions about courage and fighting spirit. The rejection cost lives, as American pilots using aggressive tactics in early Pacific combat died at rates exceeding 60% while achieving mediocre results. Organizations that prioritize cultural conformity over empirical effectiveness make similar mistakes repeatedly, rejecting innovations that work because they don't fit preconceived notions of how things should work. The Flying Tigers demonstrated that survival and effectiveness aren't contradictory, Pilots using Chennault's patient, disciplined tactics survived at rates far exceeding pilots using aggressive tactics while achieving far better combat results. The coward's doctrine wasn't cowardly, it was smart. Living to fight again isn't cowardice, it's strategy. And sometimes the people calling you a coward are the ones who don't understand that war rewards effectiveness, not dramatic gestures. 1935 was when Chennault published Role of Defensive Pursuit, advocating altitude advantage and diving attacks. 1935 was when the tactical school rejected it as coward's doctrine and un-American. 1937 was when Chennault was forced to retire for refusing to stop advocating his tactics. 1941 was when the Flying Tigers began combat using the rejected tactics. 1942 was when they achieved 296 Japanese aircraft destroyed with 14 pilots lost, a 21.1 kill ratio, while reducing casualties from 60% to 12%. 1943 was when the tactics became standard Air Force doctrine. 2025 is when boom and zoom remains fundamental to fighter aviation, vindication for the man they called a coward. One tactician, one rejected doctrine, called cowardly for refusing to fight aggressively. Forced to retire for insubordination, proved right by 296 enemy aircraft destroyed, and 21.1 kill ratio, demonstrated that surviving to fight again beats dying heroically. And that courage means doing what works rather than what looks brave. Not because aggression is wrong, because effectiveness matters more than appearances. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of people who were right when everyone else was wrong. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We honor those who understood that survival and victory aren't contradictory. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.